Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the last bastion of 2020, the listening log update for December of 2020. We have 18 records to get through. Any other requests I had that were pertinent are going to be talked about here. Some catch up, some stuff I missed, some stuff that had been sitting on the back burner in my brain for so long to talk about. All happening here. We're throwing 2020 out the fucking window. Let's get going. Now obviously this seems a little less timely to make now because I've already dropped my year-end lists and this was on there along with some other stuff you'll see me talk about. But Yungblud's weird. Like I said in my year-end wrap-up, I was never completely sold to this guy from the get-go because I thought his outcaster image felt very manufactured to the degree that it was being pushed to me. And while digging into the lyrics of tracks like Teresa, it felt very honest, the writing, but the music still felt very phoned in and like really fabricated in a way that drew me out of any sort of counterculture vibe he was trying to put out. I really appreciate that there are some attributes to Yungblud's personality that are permeating into the youth, like embracing dressing from a different gender that may not be your norm, stuff like that, breaking conventional norms in that regard. I really appreciate, and I appreciate, again, somebody writing music that comes from a sincere place at times, or even having, videos that sort of try to tap into that as well. But the tunes just don't carry that weight to the same sincerity. While I like the sounds in a track like Super Dead Friends for trying to tap into this like super aggressive idea, it still has this sort of sheen around it that makes it feel, again, like it was calculated in a room. Or I dig the thought, but the attempt wasn't quite to what I was hoping for. Plus, I hate the production on this, not just because it's super clean and whatever, but his vocal production across the board, I despise. I think the only track where it really shines, or at least one of the ones there where it shines the brightest, is Super Dead Friends. The super aggressive sounding track. Those type of vocals, for the production for those vocals, fits. But for how clean and over-compressed it all sounds, it feels like it makes the more sincere moments have less weight to them because it's so overbearingly loud. And I don't like a lot of the production ideas on here in general. The drums have that similar punch. Everything just sounds like it was recorded in a vacuum where nothing, context for where things lie in the mix doesn't fucking matter. And I hate that. I hate that so much. I didn't harp on it as much in my review. I more talked about the disingenuous feel of the project, and that really is there. It sounds derivative of other things. Even Super Dead Friends sounds like a Beastie Boys knockoff. I was talking to some friends about this prior to recording, and my buddy John had mentioned that one of the tracks on here sounds like a sort of rework, or at least the lead riff sounds like a rework of a Tame Impala song. Like, there's definite moments, components of this where it sounds derivative. There's components where the production is lacking, and there's components where the overall delivery of the messaging just is lesser because of how everything is tied together. I didn't like this project. You could probably tell from that in my having it on my worst of the year list, but I just wanted to kind of have a full-fledged thing here, breaking it down a little more, talking about things that I didn't like in the sounds and the production and the songs, stuff like that. I think that it's not the worst by a margin, but it's definitely one of the worst I heard in the last year. I'm giving this a 4 out of 10. I get lost sometimes with you. So I may have had the worst jumping on point for Biffy Clyro, because I got into them on their last record, Ellipses, which was one of my worst albums of that year. I thought it was like neck deep in parts of Yungblud's sterile-less, edgeless pop rock. And this new record, Celebration of Endings, sees them adding a little more edge that I know that they're known for into their sounds, to a good degree. I like this a decent margin above Ellipses. I still wouldn't say it was one of my favorites of the year last year, but I do enjoy what it has going on in it. I enjoy some of the riff work. I like some of the more aggressive, potent tendencies like the closer Cop Syrup. I actually enjoy the softer moments on here than I did on their last record, like Space. I think that's a really heartfelt, charming love song. My issue stems from more of some of the riff work and song construction. I don't like The Champ as a track. I don't like its lead riff. It sounds really generic to me, and I hate the harmonies on that track. I feel like it, again, sort of detracts, it creates this weird atmosphere that doesn't sit well with me, any spins that I gave it. Tiny Indoor Fireworks is like on par with some of the some of the stronger moments on Ellipses, which is a weaker record in context of their discography. It's a little more of a straight-laced, catchier song. I enjoy some tracks in here like North of No South and Weird Leisure. I like some of their riff work. I still think that they can do better, but I dig the weird time signature stuff that they're doing. You know, I dig how they construct rock like that in that fashion. And I dig some of the lyrical content as well. I think that this record, for all of its misses, has a lot more hits going on, and even the misses don't undersell them as hard as Ellipses did to me. I genuinely do want to listen to their earlier stuff after visiting this, because I think that there's some great stuff on here that I think would go toe-to-toe with some of the other rock albums that I listened to this year, as far as, again, musicianship, actually great lyricism, and a good harnessing of one sound. But yeah, this record's solid. It's a pretty solid release. I feel like if you want a more well-rounded rock experience that has some cleaner production that doesn't necessarily detract from any of the issues or any of the other things it has going on for it, I feel like you would enjoy this, A Celebration of Endings. I think it's very solid. I'm probably going to give it a 6 out of 10 because for all of its greatness, even its intimate moments, again, sounding a lot better than Ellipses may have come across, its moments where it undersells itself still stick out to me a little too glaringly for me to score it any higher. I've been following Kid Cudi's rise back into good graces in the public eye post Speed and Bullet to Heaven since his bounce back. You know, while I thought Speed and Bullet to Heaven was rough, I was still excited for his follow-up to it, Passion, Pain, Demon Slaying, and I thought it was an incredible return to form. Kitsy Ghost, a great collaboration with Kanye West, an incredible release. And when he started dropping singles last year, I had been covering him on the channel to some capacity. And with him promising a return back to the Man in the Moon series with this third entry, The Chosen, I was really excited. And walking away from this project, I feel like he has once again made another step, and he's reached a quality that I would equate to his earlier material IMO. Because what he does on this release is melds that classic, at this point, iconic, you know, trademark Man on the Moon style with even more contemporary sounds that he has almost been sort of the progenitor of at this point. You know, with some of the beat work on tracks like She Knows This, or the track Show Out with Pop Smoke and Skepta, or the Trippie Redd track as well. He melds those with a lot more of the Kid Cudi-isms, whether it's spacious synth work, like on Tequila Shots, or Another Day, or even some of the, again, the lo-fi touches on She Knows This, or a track like Lovin' Me, or Elsie's Baby Boy, which has that same kind of sort of off-the-beaten-path style that Cudi sort of became known for in his early Man on the Moon days. And he melds the two in this really good marriage. You know, I feel like Cudi sounds just as harnessed as he did in those old days, and I really enjoy this project. Is every track a smash? No, but I do think it is a much tighter release than Passion, Pain, Demon Slaying. You know, I think some of the hook work isn't the strongest in comparison to some of Cudi's other hooks. I feel like some of the more accessible moments, or potentially accessible moments, get washed away when compared to other tracks on the record that really hit this peak transcendency, like on Dive or Solo Dolo Part 3. A lot of the emotional resonance that Cudi is known for hits really hard, And it's those moments that I feel like are where the record stands the strongest to me. But I really enjoy this release. I enjoyed it a lot more than I initially did. I figured I would like it, because again, I like Passion Pain. I've been kind of fighting for Cudi since his bounce back. You know, I thought Kids See Ghosts was great. And I feel like this is, again, another step in the right direction, in my opinion. And it, again, creates one of its tightest, most concise, well-constructed records to date. And I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed Man on the Moon 3 in a way that I was expecting, but not necessarily to the caliber that I did. I feel like if he continued to harness what he's got going here, continue to channel what he has influenced while forging off on his path that he has done so well, he could make an even better record from this personally. This is a record I was incredibly excited for, if for a different reason. The Avalanches' We Will Always Love You is a follow-up to their admittedly weaker but still strong comeback from 2017 Wildflower, and I was hoping to see a little more of cohesion across tracks, a little bit less of a leaning on some of the sonic tropes that coded Wildflower, and I feel like that comes across on We Will Always Love You, while a little more buried in its own haziness, to the point where some of the micro songs and interludes on here could have easily been tacked onto the end of other tracks. What experiences here, for the most part, still comes together incredibly well. Like Wildflower, this is very heavy with collaborations, some of which are incredibly weird on paper, but work really well, like on the Divine Chord with MGMT and Johnny Marr, a collaboration that when seeing it I was stoked to hear and was easily one of my favorite moments on the project. It utilizes that ambience incredibly well, and the whole tone that the record's going for comes across great on that track. But I also really enjoy some of the other tracks on here throughout part of the front half. Like Interstellar Love, I think, is another really good song. I love the opener, Ghost Story. Out of the songs that sort of feel like it's tapping into the sonic concept of forlornness and reminiscing, this one and the first sort of leg of the record in general sort of hits that note incredibly well. I do think the record kind of loses its footing by the end of it, and it sort of gets bogged down in its own monotony. I feel like some of the collaborations seem a little spotty, like the Denzel Curry track. I like Denzel on it, but he is easily the strongest component on a track that's a little weird. I feel like the Kurt Vile song also doesn't hit me in a way that I feel like it should, but I feel like it works better than like the Rivers Cuomo song. You know, while there's a hodgepodge of collaborations, some of the mixed bag approaches work, and some just kind of fall short to me. And again, it kind of gets lost in its own atonalness, and the general pacing of the project just feels a little scattershot when you're really breaking down the minutiae of the project. That holds it back for me. I feel like it's a step in the right direction thematically, conceptually, sonically. It's in a pillaging forth in a direction that I feel like is more akin to their classic debut, and I feel like the more collaborative approach of Wildflower did pay off in some regards on this, but it still falls short of being truly great. But I'm still going to be giving this a 7, because I genuinely like a lot of the tones, the lyrical threads that are on this, and I enjoy that ethereal sound that they're going for on here. I just wish it were kind of pulled together a little tighter, personally. So this new Pain of Salvation record was a request by Rockin' Movies with Tyler, a frequent viewer of the channel. And while not my introduction to this group, I wasn't the biggest fan of my introduction to their to this band. Their last record, in the Passing Light of Day, I thought it was alright. It was fine. It was a sort of by the numbers prog album to me personally. It didn't do anything to wholly wrap me into its concept or anything like that. I thought a lot of the production was very passé, and I checked it out purely on whatever hype I had seen it was getting, and immediately was sort of underwhelmed by it. It was a bloated release by and large that I don't think really accomplished a whole lot across its runtime. And Panther, I feel like accomplishes even less. I really didn't like this record. If you caught my top 20 written list of my worst albums, this was on there. I didn't really like a lot of this project by and large. I felt like some of the experiments the band was going for on some of the more minimal ambient-driven tracks didn't lead to anything fruitful. I thought that those elements clashed with some of the more traditional, whether rootsier or electric, like a traditional prog elements didn't fit those ambient styles at all. Tracks like Unfuture, Wait, and Keen to a Fault feel bloated to an even worse degree when juxtaposed against some of the more slower tracks. I think their vocalist is doing some weird experiments that I don't think come across all that well. And this project left me even less enthralled to dive even deeper into it because none of its sonic elements fit well together, and I feel like a lot of the production as well sort of held it back. This record was even more of a slog to get through, and I thought their last record was kind of a chore, to be honest, because of how wrapped up in itself it was. But it doing that while also just being sonically uninteresting just left me all the more dissatisfied with my time with it. You know, I feel like I've heard modern prog do better at adapting sounds and embracing different ideas better than this. And a lot of the production ideas that they're wanting to do don't enhance some of those experiments to me and make them feel more meddling and sort of mediocre, personally. It's not bad because its writing is terrible or its production is outright horrible. It's competent in that regard, but instead it's the band themselves that sort of sets themselves back from success, even more so this time around, in my opinion. Again, not the worst of the year, but it did end up in my top 20 for its own reasons, and I'm giving it a 4 out of 10.
Throw on my tux, then I give 0 fucks, then I act like a jockstrap.
Even further down the rabbit hole, I put Eminem's Music to Be Murdered by Side B very high on my worst of the year list. I hated this release. I thought it was incredibly hard to sit through for a very different reason than Panther. Eminem is following the trend that a lot of rappers and artists were doing this year and re-releasing their record that they dropped earlier with a deluxe edition that contained a whole second record's worth of tracks in that track listing. And side B of Music to Be Murdered By, while having some tracks that tie more into the thematic scene on Music to Be Murdered By 1, like having more Alfred skits, having Alfred's theme sampled in a track, Black Magic popping up, tying into some of the more female-driven stuff from Music to Be Murdered By, or even having a track like Zeus where he's a little more reflective, and the track Discombobulated really tying into Vintage M in a way that I think works incredibly well for him. The bars on this project are very bad, whether it's tracks like Nat, which see him tapping more into the corona, virus stuff that a lot of artists were tackling, but in his own very bad Eminem way, or a track like Tone Deaf, a track that was on my worst of the year list, where he's tapping into his encore era in a way that I don't think works because of its minimal beat, its really bad bars, and its attempts at trying to deflect any sort of problems he may have with the criticism he faces. Hell, it's not the only moment where he taps into that old style. Key has that Pee Wee Herman voice done to death in one track. Not the only two tracks that really showcase the bad sides of Eminem either. Favorite Bitch, while trying to equate hip-hop to a woman, is terrible. And She Loves Me, while spinning a hook that also was on the new Atmosphere record, oddly enough, speaking of another white dad rapper that used to have a little bit more edge to his sound, Atmosphere spun that hook much better on the track that's on The Day Before Halloween. And Book of Rhymes, and just really showing that he's spitting out literally anything at this point to put over a beat just to try and make a buck. It's the most desperate attempt at elongating something that I had seen an artist of this caliber do in their career by having some of the weakest attributes of their sound crop back up. While, yeah, I could maybe do a redacted of this at some point and take out the tracks from side A that I didn't like and put the side B on there. But this project still sucks a lot worse than side A by a decent margin. It's why it ended up so high on my worst of the year list. I'm giving this a 2 out of 10. It's really that bad, guys. On the adverse of that, Miley Cyrus actually pulled together an incredibly concise project with Plastic Hearts, a record that sees her using her rougher voice to pair really well with this 80s throwback in a way that doesn't sound like a lot of the sounds that a lot of her pop contemporaries are doing. It still feels very Miley at its core, and I feel like that is what makes Miley an artist that still gets talked about, regardless of the quality of work. She can still find a way to make anything she's tackling, even if it's done by her contemporaries, still sound intrinsically herself. And her lyrics tie a big component of that. You know, her whole mantra, her whole career has been, I can't be tamed. I'm an uncaged beast. You know, I'm a wrecking ball of emotion. And that rings out a lot on here, on a lot of this project, like on the title track, or on Gimme What I Want, or Night Crawling, or even parts of some of the singles on here, Prisoner and Midnight Sky, a track that is a fucking bop. I love the hook of that track. And I like a lot of the hook work on here in general. I think that a lot of her collaborations, you know, the Midnight Sky remix, but also a lot of the collaborations, by and large, work really well, whether it's new people like Dua Lipa or Billy Idol. I feel like the Joan Jett feature might be the weakest, and it still isn't outright awful. It's just a little underwhelming given the cooks in the kitchen on that particular track and how heavily into that, you know, attitude Miley played into a lot of her marketing for this project. I was hoping that that track in particular would have hit harder than it actually did. But this record, by and large, is incredibly concise, incredibly tight, and definitely carries Miley in a direction that I really enjoy. You know, I loved the stuff she did with Black Mirror, the Nine Inch Nails stuff, obviously, but I was hoping to see more of that on this project, and while it isn't fully there, what glimpses of it do shine through, I think really embody that Miley Cyrus needs to make more music like that, because it suits her attitude, it suits her writing, it suits her voice incredibly well in a way that some of her other pop-leaning stuff or just outright weirder experiments never fully paid off in the same regard. I think this record is very solid for all of its misfortunes, whether it be just lackluster performance, lackluster production, subject matter being tackled better on other songs. It still comes out net positive to a decent degree. I feel like if you enjoy really tight pop music that has a little bit of edge at points, you'll enjoy this Miley Cyrus project. I think it's incredibly solid, and I feel like, again, actually has me kind of excited to see what she could pull off next. I'm giving this a 7. Incredibly solid, very much worth your time if you like this sort of thing. To say Megan Thee Stallion was on the come up in 2020 is an understatement. She was on one of the biggest hits of the year. She was able to take a huge controversial event that happened to her and find a way to be above it, even if she does call attention to it in some really sharp ways on this record. But fuck Corey Lanez, fuck everything that motherfucker wants to do, wants to come across as, because obviously Megan's in the right 1000%. But she was also just had hit after hit, collaborations just firing off on all cylinders. It was a great year for her, all things considered, and good times as a celebration of all that, by not only including some of those collaborations like Girls in the Hood and the Savage remix with Beyonce, a remix that I think comes across really well. I like the Savage remix. I like Beyonce's edition. I like what she adds to the track, and to have a track that celebrates savageness, especially in the female realm, but just in general, Beyonce, given some of her recent things that she's been doing, definitely fits that caliber to a T in the grander scale. So I like that collaboration. I like her flipping of Boys in the Hood with her Girls in the Hood. And I like a decent amount of this record when it hits its stride. You know, I don't mind its overall continuing dip into hypersexualization. It's kind of what helped get her big this year to begin with. Her part in WAP is incredible, and I feel like the tracks that extend that, like Movie outside of its hook, Do It on the Tip, and even Freaky Girls, I think come across as incredibly well. Do I think some of the hook work on the record is kind of repetitive or just lackluster? Yeah. Like I said, I don't really like Movies. I think Body's hook is really lazy and a little too repetitive for how short that song is. But I feel like, again, this record as a whole, a celebration of all great things Megan Thee Stallion, whether it is her great utilization of hypersexualization, her outright savagery, and her just great embracing of her power as a voice in hip-hop, or just her, again, in the opening track, calling out Corey Lanez for the fucking loser that he is. The strides of this record are great. I just feel like it sort of falls apart in the middle. A lot of the tracks without features don't stand as tall. Not to say that Megan can't carry her weight on her own, because I feel like the non-hook components of Body work really well. And again, I like Girls in the Hood for what it's trying to do. And I even dig Work That Fine Enough. I just feel like the moments where Megan is purely on her own, she doesn't even shine as well on as she does with guests. I feel like the tracks with guests, she just goes that much harder on them. And that may just be a component of her really really getting in the pocket and channeling energy really well in a group setting. But I don't know. I still think Megan's a great writer. I think she's a hell of a spitter. And I feel like, by and large, outside of some of her weak hook work, this was a great embracing of her excellence that she had achieved in 2020. I'm giving this a 6 out of 10. It's really solid. I feel like if you like catchy hip-hop or just some dirty-ass shit, you'll like components of this project, personally. The Network is Green Day's Devo worship side project. They made one record in the American Idiot era that I never listened to, and they dropped a new record this year that I figured I'd check out because Green Day can't do any worse, right? They were already embracing Foxborough hot tubs in a way that felt really derivative. Will they get worse on this Network project? No. This is definitely better than Father of All Motherfuckers record, but it still comes up short in some regards. I actually like a lot of the sonic characteristics of this project. I feel like Billy Joe Armstrong's Mark Mothersbaugh impersonation comes across pretty well. I like the synth tones that they use. I just feel like this mindless self-indulgence-ish approach at micro-song, lots of micro-songs across a project mentality leaves some tracks feeling a little undercooked or just outright useless and purely exist on title alone. Like Pizzagate, a 47-second interlude that just does nothing but exists to act as clickbait for a scandal that happened in politics. A lot of this record feels like it's trying to play political catch-up, but in a way that's a little more tongue-in-cheek than, say, your American Idiots or anything they would have written on, like, Revolution Radio. You know, tracks like Ivanka is a Nazi are clearly just jabs at Ivanka Trump in a way that I think is very punkish, more punkish in a way than what they were trying to do on Father of All, and Flat Earth, again, kind of spinning that in a very ironic, lol, we love Devo sort of way. But I just feel like this record is too much. It's too much for how little each track tries to present. And it ultimately spreads itself a little thin. You know, again, other tracks like Hey Elon, or Cancer is the New Black, or That's How They Get You, you know, feel like they ultimately exist to try to throw a small micro concept of a song about a certain particular subject matter into the ether, and it kind of just hits the surface and it just immediately sinks to the bottom without leaving any sort of actual impact on me, the listener. Some tracks are okay, but a lot of it sort of just feels, again, a little spread thin. I like the sounds. I'd like to hear them fleshed out in a more meaningful or in an even more post-ironic manner on some of the tracks that I did enjoy on this. And again, I actually dig Green Day with synths. I think it sounds kind of cool. I could dig more of this, more so than whatever the fuck Father of All was doing. This is all right. It ended up on the bottom of my worst of the year list, but that's because I didn't listen to that much bad shit. It's still getting a middle of the road release or score because of how spread thin the record feels, but it's still definitely a stone's throw greater than Father of All Motherfuckers. It's getting a 5, but it's a stern 5 that sits above, well above, anything that Father of All could have been trying to pillage forth. Big time.
Every time it rains, it sometimes gets too much.
Paul McCartney coming back was a big surprise, but I thought McCartney 3 was a really solid attempt at creating more tunes from the Beatle. You know, I dig a lot of the grooves on here. I dig some of the accompaniment that joins some of the songs, and I feel like even in his older age, Paul McCartney writes some slammin' tunes personally. I think the grooves on Find My Way, Lavatory Lil, and Slidin' feel like vintage, like Beatles in like a non-psychedelic sort of way that sees him sort of throwing some slick guitar grooves in there. I dig the extended cut Deep Deep Feeling a lot. I dig the vibe of that track, and I feel like McCartney uses a longer track listing in a way that I enjoy. I just dig the overall tone of the track. I dig the sounds, and I feel like it's a good middle point in the record, especially when paired with the more, again, classic psych leanings on tracks like Longtail, Winter Bird. I think that some of the subdued moments are a little underwhelming, but I think Kiss of Venus is a beautiful song. And I think the closer Winter Bird, When Winter Comes acts as a good sort of bookend to sort of meet the sonics of the record from the beginning at a good close and throw it into something a little different. I think that this is honestly a really solid batch of tracks from a dude that could have easily burnt out decades ago. I like that McCartney is sort of embracing his contemporary side, or embracing his traditional side with a little more of a contemporary twist in some facets. It doesn't feel super groundbreaking or new age. It's still very old school rocker. But I don't know, the overall vibe of the record still fits snugly in some of the sonic landscapes of the year very well, in my opinion. I think that he could have done far worse, and he kept it stripped back in a way that worked for me personally. Again, some of the softer moments, whatever. Some of the other tracks, like Women and Wives, didn't do as much for me as others. But I walked away from this net positive much more than I thought I would have. I think it's cool. I give it like a 7. It's a really solid release, I think, personally.
In my hometown.
While it was a welcome surprise to some regard, because I really liked Folklore, I honestly also was not excited to have another Taylor Swift record to drop in 2020, because for all that I liked about Folklore, its more meandering moments still sat in the back of my mind, and I was fearful partially that another record of that would have the same follies, and it doesn't, but it has different ones. I actually like a lot of what Evermore presents, and like that in some aspects it doubles down on both the country side of Taylor while also doubling down on the I collaborated with Bon Iver, Heyman, the national side of Taylor, that indie-loving side of Taylor. And I feel like both still complement each other incredibly well, like they did on Folklore. And there are even some elements that feel like a different sort of spin on a song type that was present on Folklore, namely the duet with male singer that's very intimate feeling. You know, for as much as I liked Exile, Coney Island also fulfills a similar sort of thing that I really enjoy. Again, the lyrical nuances in the writing on that song and a lot of this record, like Champagne Problems or 'Tis the Season, just accentuate Taylor's strengths as a writer and how well these collaborators helped create an atmosphere that still throttles and works incredibly well with the tone that Taylor wanted to work with. You know, it makes sense that somebody who tries to keep as busy as Taylor would make a double album in a year where you're stuck inside. For how crazy the year was, I would have loved to have just had this drop in like January or February, because the cold atmospheres sonically on this project still feel indicative of that sort of time of the year. But it's still a strong batch of tracks. I also really like this sort of thread of crime that creeps up in it, whether it's the track No Body, No Crime featuring Haim, which details this sort of whodunit story from the perspective of a killer and the person trying to catch them, you know, and it breaks down. It kind of details this story as the song goes on, and I really enjoy it, and I like the presence sonically that Haim does bring to the track. Mejerie is another song of a similar style that kind of is indicative of a different true crime case, and I like that in tandem with these songs that tackle relationships in a very Taylor Swift sort of way, she's also channeling her country roots in a very different way that I think works incredibly well. A lot of the country on here, even the opener, Willow, I really enjoy the textures and the sounds on that, and I think that it's a great tune. I wasn't recording for the second half of this review, but there are also tracks like Gold Rush and Tolerate It, which have these electronic textures that sort of creep in, especially in the track Tolerate It. It's used really well to accentuate the building crescendo in a way that I wish some of the other slower burns like Happiness sort of did. I don't mind the string swelling on that, but I feel like for a slow burn, it could have had a better payoff to me personally, at least sonically. I do like a lot of this record, and I do think that it is another solid batch of tracks coming from Taylor during this period, and I feel like she's gotten a group of collaborators together that help accentuate that cold, isolated, but also cold feeling in general, the sort of rootsier sound that really feels very reflective to Taylor herself, looking at her arc as a pop singer, and I really like this. You know, when this dropped, I made a tweet that was like, oh my god, I could definitely see myself doing a redacted to this, because I could easily combine Folklore and Evermore, and I wouldn't be surprised if I did that sometime later on this year in like the fall time. But as it stands, this record alone, it's still incredibly solid. It's just follies that are similar to ones from Folklore still kind of crop up, and I think that's just indicative of, again, the collaborators to a larger degree. And some of the tracks just don't hit as hard as others on here. But it's still a great showcasing of Taylor's talents as a songwriter, by and large, and as a songwriter musically as well. There's a lot of really good stuff here, and I think that it's still a solid-ass record, and that's why I'm also giving it a 7 out of 10, like I did for Folklore. Extremely out there metal act Oranssi Pazuzu also dropped a record last year that was incredible. It was one of those records that was actually my introduction to the band. I remember the first time I heard this, I was hanging out with some friends. We were talking like D&D or some shit, and somebody threw it on, one of the records, and I listened to this one, or we listened to it. It was one of those kind of nights, if you know what I'm talking about. But I do remember shortly after that, at least getting a more sober mindset in with this record, and I loved a lot of the textures and a lot of the crazy places some of these songs went. Hell, while all the songs on here super long, there's like 9, 10, 8-minute songs across the project. They do some interesting things with the songs themselves. Like, and pardon me for not getting any of these right, because I don't speak the language of this band, but I'm gonna try my best. Hijiden Sacramenti? That track has this incredibly great build-up that explodes and just envelops the listener in these sounds. It is so great that it actually bleeds incredibly well into the next track with Usi Technokratia. A great song that sort of carries that momentum in a way that adapts it into something completely different. This record has such dense cacophony and a lot of really not breakneck, but sort of insane evolutions that these songs go through. There's moments where they start with this ambient portion that'll eventually get to this almost chiptune-esque sound that envelops, that interjects into the chaos that is this record. And I really enjoy it. It's one of those records that isn't like other metal records where it's like, oh, this track had this hook, this song had this solo. It's all Similarly to other records of its ilk, it's this very experience-type experience. It's one of those things where you really sit down and you sort of indulge in all of the harsh screams, incredibly intense drum and guitar playing, and all of the textured sounds that are in here. The production, it's pretty raw across the board at some moments. You know, those points where the electronics almost sort of stick out really far above a lot of the jagged, harsh, raw instrumentation. But I feel like it's to great effect, and I feel like the band utilizes its sounds incredibly well. I enjoyed this project a hell of a lot, and I feel like it's one of those records where you're either going to really like it for what it has going on for it, you really like bands that take some out there ideas, or some experiments in extended movement-based songwriting, and you can run with that, or you're going to think it's too weird, because there's moments where it's just really ambient and out there that then just, again, sort of bleeds into this chaos that can really turn people off. There's some jarring moments on here, for sure, but as somebody who's into weird shit, I put that jazz record really high up on my releases this year. I really like music that can test the listener, or give it this really one-of-a-kind experience in its style. And not to say that other stuff doesn't exist like this. You know, the new Igor record is also really out there and weird, but for a very different reason than this Oranssi Pazuzu. This thing is very much in line if you like stuff like really intense, almost black metal type stuff, or, again, just really drone-centric heaviness, you'll enjoy this project. And I did as well. You know, it wasn't a record that I was hankering to come back to as much as some of the weirder stuff I heard this year. No, but it still ended up pretty, you know, up there on my top 50 of the year list. I enjoyed this a lot. And I feel like if you like bold, out there experiments, you'll also enjoy this. And I give it like an 8 out of 10, personally. And while we're keeping it noisy and abrasive, the new Black Dresses record, Peaceful as Hell, also popped up on my radar earlier on in the year, but I didn't get to it until later on because there was just a lot of shit that happened. But I wanted to make an effort to get to this because a lot of its genre tags or stuff that people were lumping it into was stuff that I was interested in, especially like the electro-industrial tag. I'm a big fan of that stuff, if you couldn't tell by the stuff that I review. And I walked away from this Black Dresses record actually kind of surprised. This Toronto duo does a good job at sort of melding some of the abrasive, again, electro sounds that I would hear on like that last The Knife record, but in a much more sort of DIY sense production-wise, or at least like an indier scale, with some of the oddness and sort of sporadic stylings I would see on like a Mindless Self-Indulgence record, with like a couple doses of like meme hyper-pop stuff that's been cropping up a lot lately, but utilized really, really well, you know, while I don't feel like it goes as bold as like a real hyper-pop like Gekek sort of stuff. It still crosses that line, you know, it toes that line. You know, some of the choruses on tracks like Beautiful Friendship, or some of the intensity on tracks like that, and Bliss and Stupidity, definitely fall in line, or again, kind of toe that line. While tracks like the breakdowns on I'm a Freak Because I'm Always Freaked Out, and Maybe This World Is Another Planet's Hell, more fall in line with the more abstract pop, sort of bubblegummy stuff that feels more in line with how the vocals are delivered on here. And to me, I feel like, while I like the vocals and I like when they get a little more compressed like those noisier pop acts, I would have liked to have seen that more often. The points where the vocals get really, really clean are the points on the record that sort of pull me back from it. But I like a lot of what this record has going on, because it is very, again, out there. It's a little more out there than your standard sort of pop stuff, obviously. But I like when they inject some of the noisier stuff, or some of the more industrial adjacent, more electro-industrial styles. I like those grooves when they find them and settle into them on here. Not that I'm against the more abstract or out there sort of pieces of this, but I enjoy those moments a lot. And I feel like the hooks aren't the biggest selling point of this record to me personally. I think they're fine. I think they hit, and I think that this is honestly was definitely something that I'm happy that I checked out. But given how much hype was going into this thing for me personally, I was a little bit let down. Do I still enjoy it? Yeah, I still think it's very solid. If you like noisier pop, or you like pop that has sort of an electro tinge to it, you'll like aspects of this record. And you might even like the vocals and the hook work more than I do. I just feel like those components could have definitely been utilized a little better. You know, I like them on parts of this, but as a whole, I feel like it's the most inconsistent aspect of this project to me personally. But I still think it's very, very solid, and I still think it's pretty good, especially if you like this sort of thing. I'm sitting with this at like a 7. You know, I wish it were a little more consistent, a little more tightened up production wise, or at least a little more tonally present. I'd enjoy it more, but as it stands, I don't. And I was a little let down. Still great, just a little let down. Let's go from jarring and weird to indie and weird-ish. The new Man record, the first that they've had in 7 years. Dream Hunting in the Valley of the In-Between. Sees the experimental Philadelphia band keeping it a little more accessible at points, while still having their chances to dip into the, odd, their own form of oddities. You know, because tracks like the opener Cloud 9 are really tight, catchy-ass indie jams that kind of leads really well into the almost reggae vibe on the mend. Again, it's reggae vibed in a sort of weird sort of way, but doesn't go the full 9 yet. The record sort of lulls you into Man's particular blend of odd. You know, they have their own eccentricities that pop up on their tracks, their love of horns and stuff like that. Tracks like the 1-2 punch of Goat and Inner Iggy are where the band's more eccentric side shows, where Goat tells this sort of full of gravitas tragedy in the form of, it almost feels like a play being unfolded for you lyrically about love and loss and all that sort of stuff. And Inner Iggy sort of talking about the turmoils and the quick shifts in the world, but in a very sort of fast, almost tropical groove is when the album really starts to settle into its weirdness. You know, this record is honestly really very solid. I enjoy this. I got into Man through Shake because more than likely 90% of the stuff from Philadelphia that I've gotten into is from Shake. He loves Man, and I've listened to him here and there, but definitely he's the bigger fan of them. But I wanted to listen to this because, again, new band I'm aware of, dropping a new record that's been a while. Why not check it out? And I feel like this is a decent return to form. I dig the songs. I think they have some good stuff on there, and I think this is pretty alright. I feel like if you're wanting something more bold and weird, I would listen to some of the stuff I've talked about earlier in this record, or even some of the stuff I've reviewed maybe earlier in the year, like the new Igor record, if you're wanting something that's like the full 9 and weird. But this toes that line in a very tasteful way. You know, there's some songs that don't necessarily fully hit me the same way as others. Like, I think some of the stuff on the back end, like The Prettiest Song in the World or Sheila, don't necessarily hit it as hard. I think some of the interludes don't necessarily do as much for me, but it's still an enjoyable experience through and through. It feels like the band's sort of definitely trying to keep it accessible at points without losing their own foundation in a cool way, and I appreciate that. And that's why I think this record's solid. I think it's a decent enough time, and I feel like if you like wholesome indie rock that gets a little weird at times, give this a spin. I give this like a 6 out of 10. It's solid enough, personally. Alright, let's scale it back, though. Let's go to a realm of normalcy on the complete opposite side of that spectrum. Let's talk about Katy Perry. Now, like some of the other records I've talked about on this this listening log update already, I've already talked about in at least a brief instance on my end of the year list, my worst of the year. This is at the bottom of the video version. It's my number 11 pick, and it's because, granted, I didn't expect much to come out of this record because, one, it's Katy Perry, one of my least favorite sort of singers in the pop realm. Not that she's a bad singer, but as far as her contemporaries go, she's easily one of the more uninteresting ones sonically as a whole. And some of the singles on here have been in rotation for like a year plus. So the bar was already pretty low. But even it was sort of undercut in that purely for how lazy this thing sounds. You know, there's tracks that try to do something different, like Champagne Problems. Second album I've been talking about this month that has a track with that title, that throws a little bit of a disco groove in there. And yeah, I like disco grooves, so whatever. But there's also tracks like Harley's in Hawaii, which feel like lazily throwing an acoustic guitar under a trap beat to try to set a vibe. And it fails on execution. And on top of that, a lot of this record just feels like autopilot. Whether it is the opener, Never Really Over, which again has been a pop song on rotation for a while, that then leads right into the just as boring Cry About It Later, and really just sort of runs the gambit of monotony from there. It's a record that starts off on the wrong foot and does nothing to save itself from stumbling outside of a couple of flares in the forms of those, you know, genre experiments that either succeed if you like that sort of thing or just feel like phoned-in attempts at tapping into what's popular right now. You know, I can't say that a lot of this is stuck to me either. It's a very atonal record as a whole. You know, for a singer who I already, again, don't seek for the most fruitfulness from, this felt like it gave me the most diminishing returns out of a record that I have checked out from her. You know, while her last record was an attempt at trying to get modern, it was at least a beautiful disaster. This, not so much. It feels like a whimpering crawl back into trying to retain, you know, normalcy. The only reason why it's not getting a lower score is because the production's fine, and while it's not actively bad across the board, that saves it from getting anything worse than a 3 out of 10 for me. It is for sure one of the most bland pop records I'd heard all year, but it is easily not the worst because other bands were actively trying to either end their careers or make something that was just as sterile as this, but it was a fresh thing for them, so it's even worse as a result.
Be your daddy, younger enough to fuck your mama. All the shit that I have.
I'm gonna be honest, the only reason I checked this out is because I fucked with his last record, Rapper Go to the League, a lot more than I thought I would. Like I said in that review, I've never been the biggest 2 Chainz fan. I got a lot of respect for him because of his tenure in the game, his ability to craft good hooks for other people, and his punchlines sometimes hit pretty well. But by the by, I wouldn't say I go out seeking, or I went out seeking 2 Chainz singles because they just weren't my thing. And parts of the last record still have that. Parts of this record still have that. But I feel like this record's bigger detractor to me are the moments that do tap into that non-conscious or feel like the lazier, more single, grabby side of 2 Chainz feel more phoned in than the moments that aren't like that. The biggest offender of this is Moneymaker, whose beat is awful. I can look at a track like Quarantine Thick and at least appreciate Mulatto's part in it as like the juxtaposition of what 2 Chainz is rapping about, and I think it's funny that 2 Chainz wrote a song about liking a girl more after quarantine because she got quarantine thick. But Moneymaker actively sucks very badly. And I also don't like the track with Kanye, Feel Away. I don't really like that track either. You know, a lot of the tracks like that don't really do much for me. The track with Kevin Gates, not one of my go-to tracks on this project. And really a lot of the first half, outside of Gray Area and Can't Go For That, which has a great sample in it, don't do a whole lot for me. The back half of the record, though, is where the record really starts to get a lot more consistent for me. Whether it's the track Vampire, which has some good, you know, I like the hook of Vampire, and I like the message he's trying to, or the lyrics he's trying to spin with that. I like the storytelling on Southside Hove, and I really enjoy the story on the track Tony. Really, I like what 2 Chainz does when he really wants to get serious, and I feel like as somebody who was an outsider to 2 Chainz, I was very excited and intrigued to see that come to life on Rap to Go to the League, more so for me, and I feel like it's still there on this record, but its lows, man. Its lows hit way too off base. Again, far from the worst of the year, because I feel like 2 Chainz is actually really consistent on this project. The hooks on here, I think when they hit better than the hooks on Rap or Go to the League. But its lows, man, they stop it from getting any higher than the score I'm giving it. But I feel like if you like 2 Chainz, you'll like a lot of what he's spinning on here. You know, it's funny, when this came out, one of my coworkers told me to check it out. And I had put it in the back of my mind because I liked his last record. And I don't hate the experience I had with it. Again, he definitely sort of took a while to get going. But once he did, I dug it. I dug it a lot. I give this a 5 out of 10. If those shitty tracks weren't here, and the weaker moments, because the Kevin Gates song is fine. It's nothing horrible. It's just a track I don't like as much on the record. This could have been a lot better, but those tracks exist, and they bring down that score a hell of a lot to me personally. The Smashing Pumpkins made a synth pop record, and it's way too long. I do like this record. I think that it's salvageable as fuck, because tracks like the title track, which do a better job at utilizing some of the synthetic percussion than other aspects of the record, like StarCraft, which is the biggest offender, that has this acoustic guitar with this really generic on the floor clap in the background, just creates this really bad sonic mix that really is indicative of a lot of the record. While I like this record, or at least aspects of this record, like when the synths meld really well with the style that they're going for, like on Wish, or on Ramona, which does a decent job. It's still not great. It's not as good as Wrath or Dulcet and E, but it's a moment where it shines a little better. The sonics, when they meld well, actually do a good job at presenting this synth-driven atmosphere that honestly could have easily sounded like Silver Sun pickups, if we're being honest. Didn't. It stuck very much in a Smashing Pumpkins kind of way. You know, tracks like Adrenaline or The Hidden Sun use the synthetic propulsion or texturing to their liking. You know, I don't think Billy's voice works incredibly well across the record. Telegenics is another track that I feel like his voice doesn't, it just clashes. His crooning, whatever he's doing, doesn't fit the vibe of the record. But the record itself, when it shines really well. It's just got inconsistent mixing and really could just use with the trimming. Even some of the tracks that I do like, just, I feel like they're better suited for like a B-side. You know, the record itself has good things. It has some good hook work as well. Like I said, on the title track itself has a really decent hook on it. I think Schadenfreude has a pretty decent hook. You know, there's decent hooks coded on this, which if they're going for a more synth-driven sound or a synth-pop influence sound, you'd hope to have some hooks on here. But I like that when they do decide to make a hook, they make it stand out, whether it's a good flourishment or just a good groove at its core. You know, it feels like while synths aren't new to this band, the way that they're using them feels fresh for them, and I feel like definitely lends to some highlights. It's a bit much. And so I'm giving it a 6. Could have easily been a 7. If you trimmed it, made the mixing better, or just cut the tracks where the mixing didn't work, it'd have been great. But it's lacking a little bit in that department, in the cohesion department. But it's still solid. I've heard worse from this band. I've also heard a hell of a lot better.
Limb by limb, we all gonna cut them down, somebody acts up. I said I love you, baby, but you don't act like it. Squeeze my...
And we're going to close the year out by comparing and talking about the 2 albums by Jay Electronica that finally came out this year. Jay Electronica is an artist that's been sitting in the backgrounds of hip-hop for a while. You know, he's gotten a lot of hype over the years, and while I was not necessarily the biggest follower of his stuff, I still felt like I had to listen to this. And it came up. I didn't talk about it, but Spectrum Pulse brought it up, and we were talking about Jay-Z on the AVA podcast that he was on earlier last year, at the point last year that he was on. talking about a written testimony, which, listening to it, I was shocked at the amount of Jay-Z that this record had, but I like parts of when Jay-Z's here. He does a good job at spicing up the track listing. While, again, some would say that kind of takes from the limelight of the guy that people have been waiting to hear on a full-length record for all these years, it still feels like a good sort of cosign. Again, lyrically, he even kind of tries to tie into some of the moments on the record pretty decently. You know, especially on tracks like The Ghost of Soulja Slim and The Never Ending Story, where his imagery and his wordplay really seems to intrinsically tie not only just into the track at hand, but into the general overall concepts that the record's diving into. I was glad to see Jay spit so tightly in that sort of fashion and so cohesively, because one of Jay's weaker attributes sometimes can be as a feature artist, and given he was so prolific on this project, it doesn't all hit, but when it does, it hits pretty well. You know, my biggest complaint with this record is some of the production, just, I get it, he's going for this like lo-fi thing, and I like the sample strewn throughout it, but I don't think everything needs to sound the way that it does on here. I like a lot of the lyrical subject matter that he's wanting to tap into. I like that he's melding the spirituality and black excellence together, and I like how, again, Jay, when he accents it incredibly well. But it underperforms in some attributes to me. I don't think it's a whole disappointment. I mean, I'm also not as invested in Jay Electronica as others are. But I will say, as somebody who knows that he's been kind of sitting in the background for a long time, I could see people being upset more than I am with this release. But I do think it's fine. You know, I do like those tracks in question. I actually like the closer, API DTA. I enjoy the closer a lot. I dig the vibe of that track. I dig the wordplay and imagery on the Fruits of the Spirit, especially that Thanos line, because, you know, I like me some comic book deep cut, or because, you know, I like me some comic book references. But I dig that he has this one moment where he does stand on his own, and I feel like he does carry his weight incredibly well. You know, I feel like this definitely could have been better, but it doesn't falter more than the leak. Because later on, shortly after A Written Testimony, a fan got the unreleased shelved Act 2 record that he had wanted to drop years ago before A Written Testimony, because it's a sequel to one of his EPs, but he got it and was going to drop it on this Discord. Jay caught wind and was like, bet, do it. And they did, and they put it on Tidal and on SoundCloud. But I had listened to it after checking out A Written Testimony, and I do think it is a little weaker. It's a little more lo-fi, because I feel like these are the demos, or at least the non-mastered versions of these tracks, and I can look past that. But the tracks themselves just don't feel as cohesively woven as A Written Testimony does. You know, I feel like his presence is fewer and far between on this. I almost kind of akin it to the last, unfortunately, De La Soul project, where they were on it, and when they were on it, they were pretty solid, but they just felt few and far between. Hell, while I dig the textures and the sounds of the opener 10,000 Lotus Petals, I kind of wish it built to something. Or another track like Dinner at Tiffany's, I kind of wish it built to something. A lot of the tracks on here don't really have the same, you know, components or, you know, at least progression that made elements of A Written Testimony great. And again, that could be because it was a shelved project that was leaked, at least initially, by a fan, but officially by Jay himself. It just felt like it wasn't, this definitely wasn't worth any hype that may have been going behind it. This was very much a much more underwhelming project, and I feel like while I dig some of the verses on here, or I dig his flow on tracks like Memories of Merlot or Night of the Round Table, it just isn't as dazzling. I don't feel like it's lyrically as cohesive as A Written Testimony either, because there's definite scale and scope, and again, threads throughout that project that tie it to some ideas. The samples feel more interloped into that as well, which doesn't wholly feel like the case on Act 2. It's a solid enough record. It's fine in its own regard, but it definitely isn't quite as up to snuff as a written testimony was. I'm giving written testimony like a 6 because it still has its issues, but I'm giving Act 2 a 5 because it's not bad, but it's more boring across the board than it is a written testimony. And that was 2020. That was what I got. That was what I listened to. That was everything I checked out. What did you think of these records? What did you think of this review? I'm sorry it was so very late. January's, though, is right around the corner. It's just not going to have a whole lot on it. But if you liked this, be sure to give it a like. Let me know what you thought of the records I listened to down in the description, or down in the comments if you listened to them as well. Thank you for joining me in 2020. Hoping to not have any instances like this happen in 2021 where I'm delaying the release of the final part of a component at the end of the following year, or at the beginning of the following year, but we'll see where 2021 takes us. This is a lot to make. If you liked it, give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdy content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. I'm going to get out of here. I've been Valrack. You guys are good at live situations, and I'll see you another day.
Thank you.